and state programs related to domestic violence, sexual assault, law enforcement, and community relations, and pretrial reform. He has a bachelor's in international affairs and master's in public administration, both from the University of Georgia. Our second panelist for today will be Arren de la Torre. Arren de la Torre graduated summa cum laude from the University of Florida in 2014. Her bachelor's of science was in advertising. Arren took interest in the subject after interning with Florida Senator Marco Rubio in Washington, D.C. in 2012. Since then, she has been teaching seminars on human trafficking knowledge with a goal of prevention. Our third panelist is Julie Fleischman. Julie Fleischman is an anthropology doctoral candidate at Michigan State University in the United States. She focuses on forensic anthropology and skeletal trauma and is conducting her doctoral research in Cambodia, specifically looking at the traumatic injuries from the Khmer Rouge period. Arren,
sure. Good morning, everyone. So give me a second, I'll pull up my presentation. I'm pretty loud, so I don't really think I need a microphone, but if no one can hear me, please let me know. I'm more than happy to speak up. So as our moderator said, my name is Arren Sayama. I'm currently a Fulbright Clinton Public Policy Fellow in Timor Leste. So our Fulbright is a little different. We do kind of 80% in a professional placement, and I'm placed in the Office of the Ombudsman for Human Rights and Justice, and then the other 20% is we kind of do an independent research project. So my independent research project is kind of a combination of interests that I had previously, like before I did my Fulbright, and then also currently, directly related to kind of what I'm doing in the Ombudsman's office. So what I'm going to talk to you guys about today is community policing in Timor Leste. And so to kind of give you guys, to kind of give you guys a little bit of where I'm headed, I'm just going to give you guys a brief history of Timor Leste. A lot of people probably don't know that much about it, and I'm surely not a scholar of it, but I think it's important to kind of situate you historically because this relates directly to kind of security concerns. Talk specifically about what community policing is, how it works in Timor-Leste. I'm kind of an implementation person, very much interested in kind of the nitty-gritty of how this actually happens on the ground. Some challenges, and then I kind of want to zoom out in a minute and talk a little bit about community policing in ASEAN specifically. Okay? So, with that. So Timor-Leste is located on the island of Timor. It is in East Timor. Originally, it was subject to kind of competing colonial projects of expansion between the Dutch and the Portuguese empires. So when the Portuguese Empire collapsed, it was kind of divvied up. So East Timor went kind of its own way, and then the other side was kind of subsumed back under Indonesia. It was that way for about 500 years under colonial expansion. The Portuguese did a systematic kind of conversion to Catholicism. I mention religion here because I think it's important when we're talking about security concerns, mainly because there is a really strong kind of Catholic presence within Timor, but you also have a lot of disconnected communities that still have very strong ties to kind of tribal justice and informal justice sectors. So it's important to note that the Catholicism that's practiced in Timor is syncretic almost, in the sense that you kind of have your strong animism, but then that's kind of been Catholicism kind of grafted on top of that. So I think that's important to note. After the collapse of the Portuguese Empire in 1974, Timor became semi-independent. And then this is kind of where the dominant theory of American foreign policy falls in Southeast Asia. There are a lot of different ways, there are a lot of different kind of tellings of the story that happened. But President Ford and Secretary Kissinger were located in Jakarta for around the talks, and then the day after they left, Indonesia invaded Timor. Mainly because there were a lot of political factions that arose around that time, a lot of them with a strong communist bent. So there's a lot of kind of conversations as to the U.S. kind of backing Indonesia's invasion of Timor. And then it was occupied until about 1999 when they had a vote for sovereignty. The UN came in, they had a full UN administration from 2000 to 2006. It's also important to note that the UN has only had 2 full administrations of countries. One is Timor-Leste, and the other one is Kosovo. Since then, there's been kind of an uptick in violence and political movements. In about 2006, there was an attempted assassination of both the president and the prime minister. And then we've actually kind of reached relative stability, political stability in 2008. And so all this kind of figures into kind of security situation in your kind of communities located outside of Dili, which is the capital, and kind of where you are situated in your community. So, kind of talking about community policing and what that is. It's different in every kind of cultural context, but essentially what it is kind of an organizational philosophy that promulgates kind of a closeness between your law enforcement apparatus and your community. So what you do is you would have kind of police officers that are situated and are stationed in your communities. They deal with security issues as they arise. They also have very strong relations with kind of the elders in the community and things like that. So they're really kind of your first access point as well as kind of the troubleshooters. In Timor, it's largely an international and largely a donor influence kind of idea of community policing. So this is kind of where I kind of take a little bit of a critical look, because when Timor was kind of starting its sovereignty and the police were kind of starting up in 2002, there was just a ton of money that kind of came in. And you had a lot of donors that said, well, this is what strong police forces do. They have a community policing model. This is how this works, without kind of giving any regard to specifically the cultural context here. So what you had was really a lot of different models floating around. The first model that was tried in Timor was actually a Japanese model, and it's called the Koban system. And so they thought it would be appropriate for Timor to have the Japanese model because it's, quote, Asian. Again, without giving kind of cultural regard to where Timor is in that kind of situation. Since then, New Zealand and the US have really kind of taken over this kind of project, and the Asia Foundation has actually been the strongest implementer of kind of what the model looks like in Timor. With that, I will also say about kind of Timor's take on community policing, or at least policing in general, is that this is strongly influenced by Indonesia's occupation of Timor. What would happen is they did have a model of community policing, and they would have police officers stationed in the communities, but they were essentially spies for the government. So you have a very, very strong current of skepticism about your legal apparatus and about your security forces. So this also is kind of a guidepost for my presentation about where we are in terms of community policing. And then lastly, there have been several different versions of the Constitution in Timor, and they've all referenced community policing. You know, they've all referenced this is what we want to do, this is what we're striving to do, and this is why we should do it. But really kind of a weak implementation arm with regards to this. So specifically about kind of what community policing looks like and kind of how this works. So there's as I mentioned, there's a two-sector system. There's kind of an informal justice system and then the formal one. So the ones where you go present in front of a court, you know, and it kind of looks just like it would on Law and Order or something. There is the police, the PNTL, which is the National Police Force of Timor-Leste, and they work within 11 of the 13 municipalities. So Timor is broken up into 13, so there's kind of 12 that are all centered next to each other, and then there's a special economic zone called Oikusi, which actually is in West Timor. So parts of Indonesia, so you have to go through Indonesia to access Oikusi. So they're a little bit of an outlier. But so each community or each district has what's called a CPC, a Community Police Council. And when they started kind of 5 days of dialogue, and they would prioritize and kind of identify the security concerns within their community. And it could be anything from petty theft to sexual assault to lots of issues on land rights currently, and actually a lot of issues on kind of martial arts gangs that kind of rove throughout the country. So that's a large security concern too. And then each CPC has about 7 to 12 volunteers and 1 police officer, and they're supposed to meet once a month. We have found that they are not always doing that. We've also found sometimes some districts are doing it way more. They're meeting, you know, weekly or bi-weekly, and that's had a real positive impact. But some of the municipalities just are not there yet. And so essentially, kind of the community police officers are the first responders. They decide where the claim goes. So if you have been, so let's say you've had property stolen, so then you can either choose to go to the justice, to go to the elder within your village, or you can choose to go to the police officer. Half the time what will happen is if you go to the elder, they'll just refer it to the police officer. We have gotten to that state. If you go to the police officer, then he decides whether or not it should be arbitrated back to the community, or if it actually requires further kind of look in a formal justice way. I'll talk a little bit about the challenges and what that looks like, because then you really are depending upon your police officers to be purposeful and insightful enough to know that this is a public crime and that this should actually probably be arbitrated in a formal court of law, or whether or not this is something that can be handled at the community level. So, we have seen some success in the model taking hold after implementation about 2010. I won't bore you with some statistics, but I can talk about those kind of more in depth in questions if you guys have them. But I do want to take a look a little bit kind of about what the pathways looks like. So this was actually put together by the Asia Foundation, and so they were kind enough to let me kind of take a look at this, go on that with meetings, and also give you this graphic. I apologize I couldn't really split it up, it's just kind of a singular JPEG. Questions about data visualization, but I'm more than happy to walk you guys through it. So what happens is so you have about 22% of people that experience a crime, kind of where their first reaction is. So like I said, some of them go directly to the community, some of them go to the community leader, and some of them go to the police officer. And so then what happens is about 57% of the crimes that refer to the tribal elder actually go back to the police officer. And so then you can kind of track it, kind of how you go in terms of the process or the flow chart. So again, you really kind of have an ad hoc model here of where you're depending upon both the tribal elder and the police officer to coordinate, as well as also kind of have the same understanding of justice, which doesn't always happen. And so this is kind of what we're running up against when we're talking about implementing a community policing model, is that you have a justice system that is written largely in Portuguese. A majority of people still do not speak Portuguese, they speak Tetuan, so they cannot even read the laws that are governing their society. And then you also have a police officer that is supposed to somehow kind of arbitrate between this nexus. So it's a huge challenge in that you have to train the police officers. I think it's important to note about this is that Timor-Leste is one of the youngest police forces. I mean, it really wasn't codified until 2002. So, I mean, we're really just a little bit over 10 years now of kind of developing a really robust and kind of police system that can troubleshoot and then kind of think through these issues. You also have huge issues of funding and intergovernmental turf wars. I'm sure in a lot of kind of countries that you all are in, experience this too, and obviously the United States is prone to this as well. But here, there's conflicting mandates about who controls and who's the governing body for policy for police officers. Technically, it falls under the Ministry of Interior, but the police, the PNTL, also exists on their own constitutional mandate too. So it's one of those things where you kind of have one person and two managers, not exactly sure who should be respond to. And then within the Ministry of Interior, there are different security sectors that also have some kind of stake in community policing too. The President's office, this is a really big kind of push for them, is they really want a community policing model. Again, I think there's this kind of normative argument that this is what strong, developed democracies do. This is how their security apparatuses run, so then we should do this too. So the President is really pushing this, and so he'll allocate a lot of money, and then sometimes you don't exactly know where it goes. I will say that they're supposed to be funded so everyone has a motorbike so you can get around to the different villages in your communities, and then you're also supposed to provide housing for your police officers too. Some municipalities can do that, some can't. We're also talking about, there are a lot of places that just, they're not serviceable roads to really get to, so you're talking about very, very isolated communities as well. Data reporting is a perennial issue, I mean everywhere, but in Timor it's a little bit heightened because everything's done on a paper carbon copy based system. So if you have a complaint, the police officer writes it on a carbon copy, he takes the white one, the pink one goes to whoever, and then the yellow one goes to you. So you actually have the Asia Foundation trying to go out to the different municipalities to collect these and then are just physically inputting it into a system. So data reporting is always an issue. Development partner coordination, just in general, you have a lot of funding streams, you have a lot of people that are invested and that are interested in this. So it becomes an issue of kind of making sure that the New Zealand embassy and the US embassy are talking to each other and that they're coordinating their efforts around community policing. And then lastly, domestic violence and gender issues, which are actually a huge issue, and I do want to spend some time talking about it, but I'm kind of running out of time, so please bring up some questions. But I will say this. This was kind of a public survey that was done by the Asian Foundation on whether or not they think the PNTL or the police officers have any kind of understanding of domestic violence issues. 73% of PNT officers said yes. 33% of community leaders said no, and 46% of the general public said yes, that they do. So you can understand that there's a gap here. And even in terms of kind of like legality and legal theory of kind of what is a public crime and what is a private crime, domestic violence and sexual assault still fits firmly within the residence of the domicile, kind of where we draw what should be brought and arbitrated in a court of law. So there's still a lot of work to be done on this, and this is probably one of the larger issues that community police officers are facing, is that they just don't understand when they should intervene in a gender-based kind of conflict and things like that too. And lastly, community policing in ASEAN. I will say that from my understanding, and please if anyone is like an ASEAN scholar, feel free to correct me, but from my understanding, ASEAN, I mean, civil society is not the highest priority of ASEAN. It's really just much more of an economic kind of development, so there's not a lot of institutional support for building civil society, even though Timor-Leste is actually hosting the People's Forum in August. A few countries in ASEAN do have community policing models. Indonesia does, actually. And I'd be really interested if someone could talk to me about that. I tried to do some research, but it was kind of limited. There are some analogs for Timor-Leste in terms of the community policing model that fall a little bit outside ASEAN. Both Sri Lanka and Papua New Guinea face very similar issues in terms of kind of access issues, as well as your adherence to an informal and formal justice system, which I know that I think they're observing members of ASEAN, and then actually the Solomon Islands too has had very similar issues to Timor when it comes to kind of community policing. So that was quick and dirty, kind of community policing in Timor-Leste. I'm happy to take questions, but I'm sure we're running out of time and I kind of want to give them some time so we can talk about it later. But thank you for your time.
May I ask a quick question while you chat?
Sure, yeah.
I had an experience a year ago in a village when I was working, and I saw a case of domestic abuse.
Yeah.
And when I was walking with the villagers, they were like, "We don't talk about that."
Mm-hmm.
So do they even reach the point of going to an elder or the community, or is it not even talked about?
So it's like that. It's not even talked about. I mean, it's actually rare that it gets reported to a police officer, and when it does, sometimes the police officer doesn't exactly know what to do with it.
Okay.
It's also sensitive too because actually in Parliament session, this past Parliament session, you have the Ministry of Interior kind of talk about data and security and kind of rising security concerns. And so they said, look at all this data. Why is our crime reporting so high? And everyone just thought there was an uptick in crime. I would like to offer a different analysis of that. I think it's just that you're finally getting better data. So that crime has already existed, it's just now being reported on. And so then everyone, once that was kind of offered, people kind of took a step back and thought, oh, maybe that is true, I don't know. So you're playing this kind of game of, do I really want to report this? Because then the government might say, oh, this reflects poorly upon our actual, our ability to handle criminal issues. So it's both a cultural issue as well as kind of a political issue too. So.
Thank you. It's such an honor to be here. Who is ready to learn Tagalog? Are you ready? Okay, great. So, mabuhay, or welcome. I will be briefly talking about the assessment that I took in the Philippines about prevention on human trafficking. And so before I begin, I just want to give you a little highlight video of what I did in the Philippines, just in case we don't get to the end of the presentation. And then I'll go into the methodology and all that sort. So there's sound here, but maybe you won't be able to hear it. I think that's loud enough. I start on our findings of our research, that I briefly go over what human trafficking is, just in case you are unfamiliar. So according to the Trafficking in Persons 2015 Act, this is the exact definition, and I'm not going to go through it all too well, except I will break it down into 3 parts so it's easier to understand. And we do this for our students as well in our seminars. The first part is acts, and we have our means and our purpose. And so our acts, we basically ask our students, what are the verbs that are happening? Are they being recruited, transported, harbored? And so we kind of give them to reflect on that. As far as our means, how are those victims turned into exploited members? And so we say how. Through deception is usually the concept here. And lastly, we have our purpose. So this one's easy enough to remember, for sexual exploitation or for labor exploitation. And so that little formula creates an easier way for the students to remember what exactly human trafficking is. Now, I'm going to go ahead and throw some numbers at you, but I wanted to disclaim certain things. So the numbers that I'm putting on the screen can or cannot be accurate. And the reason being is that human trafficking is actually an illegal underground black market. So the numbers that are reported are just that. They're numbers that are reported. And so the numbers I'm going to throw at you. There are 20.1 million to 29.8 million people that are said to be enslaved in the world. The first number is given to us by the International Labor Organization, and then the second one is from the Walk Free Freedom Foundation. And so, again, just a big gap. And so we don't really know how many people are enslaved. But if we were to take the first number and place them all in one city, we can see that it would surpass the population of New York. Just this great little chart. So almost passing half the population of Tokyo, the most populated city in the world. And so being that it's such a big market, actually it's second in illegal profits for drug and gun trafficking, but it's actually the fastest growing. So last year, in 2014, it grossed about $150 billion US in illegal profits. Now, again, to put it into perspective, that's equivalent to the 4 most profitable companies in the world, 2 of them being from China, 1 of them being Apple, and lastly, the other one is in Russia. And here's some more numbers. So significance, why the Philippines? In Southeast Asia, this is a big issue. Why zone in on the Philippines? And so I'll go into that briefly. The Philippines is a special case. Not only does it happen in these reported areas, or in fact all over the Philippines, like Luzon, Visayas, and Mindanao, the 3 biggest islands, but it's said to be a source country, meaning the people that are exploited not only within the borders of the Philippines, but they are exported out to be exploited in other countries. So the Philippines is a big contributor to human trafficking around the world. The Filipino government is actually trying to crack down on stopping human trafficking from evading the world. And so they have many policy programs in the government now. They're actually ranked tier level 2, meaning that they don't meet the requirement from the Trafficking in Persons Report Act. However, they are trying really, really hard in the government to enforce more programs. And so what I'm doing is I'm focusing on the prevention efforts. So, to go into the methodology, I was based in Iloilo City, Iloilo, which is in the western Visayas. It's right in the middle of the Philippines. And there in Iloilo, they have about 30 or so programs in schools. Of about 10, we are able to actually hold the seminar and test. We had an assessment that we gave them before and after the seminar, which had 50 questions, 30 being about the actual content of the seminar, 10 about the demographic, another 10 about the feedback and how we could improve the delivery of the seminar. Lastly, we kind of had 2 objectives in mind. The first one being, we can now enumerate what the students know about human trafficking and how we can further make that information known to them. And lastly, how can we better deliver to our target audience, which is the younger generation? And so we took a presentation that I did at the University of Florida based on the economics of human trafficking. So it was kind of heavy, and slowly we changed it into something that the younger audience would like to watch. It is a heavy topic to talk about human trafficking. And so we had a simple process, tried to make it simple, but it didn't turn out that way. As far as our observations for the seminar, we noticed that students had a general idea of what human trafficking is, thanks to movies like Taken, or thanks to the news that generally reports human trafficking in the Philippines. And so they would be able to tell me, oh yeah, this is a situation of human trafficking. But they wouldn't be able to tell me exactly how it's human trafficking. For all they knew, you had to be abducted to be trafficked. And then we also noticed that students had really a lot of energy in the beginning, mostly because apparently I look like a celebrity in the Philippines, which is really funny. And then slowly we saw that they started to wane out, and then eventually we had no attention at the end. We also saw that the economics part in the presentation was a bit too heavy for their understanding, being that they didn't have a basic knowledge, or they didn't get to that course just yet. As far as our seminars, we saw that the tests that we gave had a particular vernacular that they weren't able to understand, so we had a lot of English assistance. And actually the word test or assessment was daunting to them, and they felt like they were going to be graded, that if they didn't know, it'd be better if they didn't do the test as a whole than to answer completely wrong. So from our observations, we were able to make a bit of change. So we decided to keep that informational content, this statistics, but as an advertising major, we had to see why our target audience wasn't paying attention and how we can grasp their attention and maintain it through the entire seminar, because this is a very important issue. So we decided to go with the design and take out the economics part. So this is just a visual of our first makeover. On the left side, you'll see it's very bland. I mean, I pitched it to college students, straight to the facts. And then the right side, you'll see that it's a little more fun, a little more poppy, and adds a character. And it did well for our first couple of seminars. And then we decided that we can push even further to make sure that the students get what they want. They wanted an interaction. They wanted to be involved, even though this topic was a bit heavy. So after conceptualizing, we were able to brainstorm this idea of being a superhero. Yeah, kind of funny. But not just any superhero, a modern day superhero against modern day slavery. Kunwari, another Filipino word, which means pretend. So let's pretend. The breakdown of our seminar basically is that when we entered the room, we were no longer students that were interested in making other students understand what trafficking was. We became head agents, and our audience became agents in training, almost like a SHIELD, Marvel kind of deal. And so that's what we did. This is Kenneth. He was my co-partner, and he spoke Hiligaynon, which is the local dialect. Whenever they got tired of hearing English, it was kind of hard for them. And so that was our rules in this. And then we also broke it down into 3 sections. And so this is where it gets interesting. The first section, we talked about just human trafficking as a whole. And so what we did is we personified trafficking as a villain. And so this villain is called the Traficking. And in that, we were able to do what I did in the beginning, was where I broke down what the definition of human trafficking is, and who exactly are traffickers. The common myth is that, oh, it's a scary male, he's kind of big, he's strong, but actually a woman can be a trafficker, a handsome gentleman can be. And so, again, just demything these things that they thought they might have known. And the types of human trafficking, we briefly talk about the statistics of global trafficking, and then we zone in on the Philippines and their local issues. The second part of the seminar was a victim profile. This is actually Victor, the victim. So again, a common myth is that it only happens to women. But in fact, labor exploitation holds a lot of the male population of people who are exploited. And so again, we talk about it's not just the women, it's the men. And then lastly, we unveil the superhero, which is said to be them. And so, we tell them that these are the signs to look for in our victims. We kind of make it like a little comic, which is good, and it really draws their eyes to the PowerPoint. And we also give them resources to call. This is an IACAT number, which is the Interagency Against Trafficking. And so this is a number that they can call outside of Manila. And we also tell them what their superpowers are. And being that they're just average people or a modern day superhero, if they know this knowledge, they're able to prevent themselves from being trafficked and can share the knowledge with others from being trafficked as well. And we include other ones like supervision. If you know the signs, you have the power of your phone, of the internet, social media. And so at the end, we kind of have this call to action. By this time, we've already built up all this passion, all this knowledge, and we're just trying to tie it in together so that they can go on and be the superheroes, the agents that we had trained them to be. And so at the end of the video, you saw them raising their right hand, and this is where they take like I solemnly swear to the fight against trafficking. We also decided to add the suggestions that were given on our feedback forms, which entailed a photo booth. I don't know if you know this, but Filipinos love taking pictures. Especially they love taking selfies with me and calling me Nikki Hill or some volleyball player, which was really funny. And so we saw a lot of activity even after the seminars. People were posting their pictures, they were sharing a couple of facts about human trafficking, which is the goal here. We also added more videos in our presentations. We had one video that was kind of like a pop-up and talked about 3 different scenarios of human trafficking, and we also tested them during the presentation. And then we had some games. So again, this was to demyth the fact that it's not just men that are traffickers. And then we kind of share it, have them come up, give them prizes. And then we also have a game called Bought and Sold. So instead of taking all of the economics out, we decided to keep a little part of it so that they can still understand the fact that people are no longer considered people in this day and age, that they can easily become products and sold. And so that's something that we wanted to focus on. And this is just a picture of them making something out of their bodies. As far as the assessments, we decided to keep the number of questions, but again, go about the different designs. And we also added a disclaimer. So in the beginning, we were saying, okay, now we're gonna give you a test, a seminar to complete, and we've actually changed the wording so that we just say evaluate or keep it in the scenario so that they don't think that they're going to be graded. And if they were very shaky about it, we would say, okay, this is not a test, it won't be graded, but do try your best. This, I don't know if you can see it, but just basically we fixed the layout of our questions. And so the results. We talked to over 4,000 kids, students from high school to college, and even a private session of younger students in Iloilo on the span from August to December, which is a pretty good reach. The students were finally paying attention and really wanting to learn more about human trafficking and how they can help. And we actually got a lot of volunteers from schools that said, I really want to help, what can I do? I have this talent. And we took them along with us to the next couple of seminars. As far as the results for the assessments, a lot of students were like, okay, I can do this test and I don't have to worry about being tested or getting a grade or getting in trouble if I don't study. And we saw that if we gave them the test in the beginning, they would remember the questions they were asked, and then it would improve their attentiveness and memory. So some of the challenges after completing the seminars is there wasn't any stability for volunteers. So the volunteers would just come and go if they had free time, and a lot of them were very busy or worked or helped at home. And so our sometimes I would show up at seminars and it would just be me So it was pretty difficult. And the budget was tough because students, if they wanted to volunteer, I would always help with the transportation and pay for their costs. And sometimes we would just have so many volunteers, I wouldn't have really a budget for it. So my biggest worries, especially that we're leaving the Philippines in April, is that this program will stop and just not continue. And so I was really trying to find places in Manila that would hold the program and maybe adopt it as one of their own. After talking to a couple of people, I eventually got in good terms with the Commission of Human Rights of the Philippines, the Tequila, which is a human rights nonprofit, and then Ateneo Human Rights Center. So we're briefly talking about how we can incorporate this seminar in their broad term education for human rights in the Philippines. And so they will adopt it with certain changes. So again, this seminar that we gave was not perfect, but it definitely helped with the concentration of students during the seminars. And so my recommendations for them is that if they keep doing this, they would need to make it customizable. So we've already drawn up a student toolkit and a teacher toolkit, and the presentation that I gave, it can be easily accessible through a Google Drive, or we can share the file with them. And they can customize it according to if they want to add laws, if they're more on the policy side of human trafficking, if they wanted to localize it. This is one of the hardest parts, is going to different regions and then being able to communicate the idea of what human trafficking is without trying to step the boundaries of language. So I forget, there are 7 dialects in the Philippines, so you can travel wherever and then not be able to say what you want or being misconstrued in that particular way. And then of course, within time, the facts and the statistics will change so that they have the ability to update it. And that's pretty much it. Just a special thanks to all the people that I've worked with. And I could take any questions, or we can have some coffee afterwards and talk more about this. Thank you.
Yes?
Yeah, just a quick question. So you mentioned that you give students tests or evaluations at the beginning. Were you able to look at the actual results of those and see kind of what the level of awareness is,
Sure.
or just out of curiosity?
Yeah, I think it was quite difficult trying to get through the test because there are 50 questions, and I do have to transfer it myself to a database. And so I've been inputting it, but obviously as a test by myself is very hard. So, but I'm hoping to get it finished in the next 2 or 3 months, and then get the results. But yeah, thanks for
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for being here. As Leigh said, my name is Fleischman, and I'm a doctoral student at Michigan State University. So, I'm currently in Cambodia doing my dissertation research in Cambodia. So, brief introduction to the Khmer Rouge era in Cambodia in the late 1970s. I will then discuss the analytical and conservation project at Chung Aik, followed by a discussion of my research and a new collaborative project that's getting underway at a site called Krang Tachan. And finally, I will discuss the importance of this work both in Cambodia and globally, and the interplay of human rights, followed by my conclusions. So to begin, I will provide a brief historical introduction to the Khmer Rouge era in Cambodia in the late 1970s. After a civil war in the early 1970s, the Khmer Rouge communist regime came to power in Phnom Penh in April 1975 and established the government of Democratic Kampuchea. The DK leadership, led by the infamous Pol Pot, abolished money, education, religion, and private property, and almost all Cambodians were forcibly relocated from cities to the collective farms in the countryside. The conditions were severe, and historical estimates state that between 1975 and 1979, approximately 1/4 of the Cambodian population of nearly 8 million died from mistreatment, overwork, malnutrition, and violence. On January 7, 1979, Vietnamese troops invaded Phnom Penh, ending the 3 years, 8 months, and 20 days of democratic Kampuchea. So one of the most publicly well-known Cambodian mass grave sites among nearly 20,000 in the country is Chung Aik. Located approximately 15 kilometers southwest of the center of Phnom Penh, today it is called the Chung Aik Genocidal Center, although colloquially it tends to be known as the Killing Fields. After 1977, Chung Aik was used by the Khmer Rouge as an execution and burial location for thousands of men, women, and children. The majority of the victims came from S-21, or Tuol Sleng, the highest level security and torture center in use during the Khmer Rouge period. When Chung Aik was discovered shortly after the Khmer Rouge were driven from Phnom Penh in January 1979, 129 mass graves were found. 86 of these graves were subsequently exhumed, and the remains of nearly 9,000 individuals were disinterred. So the two photos on the right, the upper right, are from Chung Aik in the early 1980s. I don't have a date for the photos, but they are courtesy of the Tuol Sleng Museum. And in 1988, the Cambodian government built a memorial stupa or shrine to commemorate and protect the victims of the Khmer Rouge regime. And it is within this stupa that the human remains have stayed virtually untouched until recently. So the stupa is down in the left corner, and that is an image of the remains within. In 2012, with the official consent of Cambodia's Prime Minister, a project called the Chung Aik Conservation of Victims at the Killing Fields was launched. Under the direction of Mr. Vuon Vuti, a Cambodian archaeologist with extensive training in skeletal preservation, the exclusively Cambodian team began their work in late 2013, and this was the start of the first comprehensive scientific analysis and preservation of human remains from mass grave sites throughout Cambodia. Mr. Vuon Vuti and his team systematically removed, cleaned, analyzed, and preserved the remains over the subsequent 2.5 years. Mr. Vuon Vuti established protocols for his project, which can be summarized as follows. The remains are removed from the stupa and photographed prior to any cleaning. Each cranium, which is essentially the skull, is labeled with an identification number and are cleaned with water and then soaked in insecticides and fungicides. Each cranium is then analyzed, and the following notes are recorded. The estimated age at death and sex of the decedent using international anthropological standards, the weight of the cranium, the length and width of the cranium, and what types of traumatic injuries are present. The injuries are described in detail, and then the cranium is photographed again to make sure that no damage occurred during the other stages of the process. Finally, the bones are put into a large dehumidifying chamber, which is the photograph that you see at the top, where they are coated with polymers or glues to strengthen the bones and further seal them against humidity and therefore further decay. After the analysis and preservation is complete, the remains are returned to the stupa. The same process was undertaken for all of the rest of the bones of the body that are in the stupa, although no analysis was undertaken for numerous reasons, but mostly time. So the project was completed in December 2015. In less than 3 years, Mr. Vuon Vuti and his team preserved tens of thousands of human bones. This is an extraordinary achievement that is yet to be replicated in Cambodia. And the photo above shows the final closing religious ceremony that we had to sort of put the remains back in the stupa and seal it up. The inventory forms for each individual has been published in Khmer, Cambodian, in a 32-volume set that is retained by the Chung Aik Genocidal Center, the Cambodian Ministry of Culture and Fine Arts, and other Cambodian organizations as scientific documentation of the work that was completed. So moving to my research as a US Fulbright student in Cambodia, I'm using a biocultural anthropological approach to address questions concerning the individuals executed by the Khmer Rouge regime and the agency, or the effects on the living individuals, of the resulting skeletal remains. The biological aspect, which I have already completed, includes analyzing 500 crania at Chunghaik, and I documented the age at death, sex, and evidence of violent death. By systematically analyzing the human remains at Chunghaik, which directly retain evidence of violent actions, I will integrate previously undocumented data into a more holistic narrative of the Khmer Rouge atrocities. The sociocultural perspective of my research will evaluate the incorporation of skeletal remains into Cambodian memorials throughout the country. While these memorials are well documented, research has not specifically addressed the role of the physical remains within. So a biocultural approach for my research is an anthropological imperative. A biological analysis of the skeletal remains provides demographic data and permits quantification of traumatic injuries. But without integrating the sociocultural context, these remains persist as isolated specimens of scientific evidence on the periphery of Cambodian life. So rather than focusing exclusively on what has been done to or with the remains since they were exhumed in generally the 1980s, my research will also evaluate what effect the remains have on living people today. So similar to my research, as well as the project that was completed at Chunghaik, a new project is being developed to analyze, document, and preserve human remains at another mass grave site in Cambodia called Krang Tachan. Krang Tachan is a former Khmer Rouge prison and mass grave site located in Takeo province, where it is estimated that more than 10,000 people were executed and at least 3,000 bodies have subsequently been exhumed. And those are photos from last year, and sort of the state of the remains inside the stupa. So under the direction, once again, of Mr. Vian Vuti, with international funding garnered by myself, this new project will be the fourth effort in the country to systematically analyze human remains from the Khmer Rouge era. This new project has three primary goals. First, to scientifically analyze the previously exhumed human skeletal remains located at Krang Tachan. Second, to renovate the memorial stupa, currently located at the site as we saw in that former picture. And three, to provide documentation about the human remains for historical and future research. The remains will be analyzed once again to determine age at death, sex, and traumatic injuries. This research will contribute to evidence of Khmer Rouge violence that has hitherto been undocumented in historical literature. So while it is informative to describe the aforementioned analytical research being done in Cambodia, how does it contribute to the international study of human rights and genocide? The analysis of modern human remains is primarily conducted by forensic anthropologists. These professionals have been involved in human rights investigations since the mid-1980s, when they were asked to help search for and identify those who are considered disappeared in Argentina. In the case of human rights investigations, forensic anthropologists can assist with the location and excavation of mass graves, the analysis of the remains within, particularly regarding traumatic injuries, and they can provide evidence and testimony in court. So it must be noted that the work with human remains in Cambodia is not currently considered forensic, as these data are not going directly to legal cases. So the court is not using them in any fashion, so it's not forensic in that sense. However, both projects, as well as my research, are providing information that has not been available until now. While there are historical and eyewitness accounts of the violence that transpired during the Khmer Rouge era, the physical remains were not analyzed until the Chung'aik project began 3 years ago. Human remains, in contrast to historical records, provide direct evidence of traumatic events in the form of distinct skeletal injury patterns that can be assessed to discern one of the key tenets of anthropology, which is human behavior. So thus, this research is vital for a comprehensive understanding of this time period and for international awareness. Specifically regarding my own research in Cambodia, I anticipate that my analyses will provide sound evidence and quantification of Khmer Rouge violence, which may contribute to future forensic anthropological analyses of mass violence, particularly, again, evaluations of traumatic injury patterns. By analyzing skeletal remains from this era using a biocultural perspective, I am attempting to unite scientific and humanistic knowledge in the production of a more holistic representation of Khmer Rouge violence both within and beyond Cambodia. However, there's always a however, in Cambodia as well as in other countries, the exhumation of mass graves, the analysis of the human remains within, and the subsequent disposition of these disinterred remains are not without controversy. It must be noted that human remains resulting from genocide or crimes against humanity are rarely accessible for research, primarily because they are politically, culturally, ethically, and religiously sensitive. Given the varying socio-cultural and religious context of post-atrocity regions, the ramifications of working with human remains must be addressed on a case-by-case basis and should include both governmental and familial and community parties. As Rosenblatt 2013 and Crossland 2013 note, for example, justice, evidence, and truth mean different things to different political, social, and religious stakeholders. In many post-atrocity nations, religious leaders, citing various religious doctrines, have objected to, quote, exhumation, autopsy, and other forensic practices, even when the mass graves in question contain crucial evidence of atrocities committed against their own members, end quote. Crossland 2002 provides another example of contested forensic work. Although the exhumations of mass graves in Argentina in the 1980s and 1990s were politically sanctioned, mothers and other surviving relatives of the victims were opposed to the exhumations. Until those who had committed the crimes were held accountable, the mothers wanted to remember their children as alive rather than deceased. As long as their children were still disappeared, the mothers could protest for accountability. Finally, the disposition of disinterred remains can be fraught with controversy. In post-atrocity nations such as Guatemala, Bosnia-Herzegovina, and other countries, the disinterred remains have been buried, often as a means to counter the disorder of mass violence and mass graves. In Rwanda and Cambodia, however, human remains are publicly displayed. In Cambodia, the display of 300 human skulls at the Tuol Sleng Museum of Genocide Crimes in the form of a map came under scrutiny by the late Cambodian King Norodom Sihanouk in the 1990s and early 2000s. In opposition to the governmental rhetoric of human remains as evidence, which persists today, the late King Sihanouk employed religious discourse in 2001, requesting that the remains of the Khmer Rouge victims be cremated in traditional Khmer Buddhist belief to honor the spirits and allow them to be reborn. However, Sihanouk later retracted his request for cremation, possibly because of political and public opposition to his proposal. The map of skulls was later dismantled in 2002, however, citing deteriorating conditions of the bones rather than any political or religious issues. So although forensic anthropology and archaeology have long been involved in the assessment of genocide and crimes against humanity, the amalgamation of forensic science and human rights is still in its infancy. Discrepancy between various stakeholders, political narratives, religious ideologies, and local and international communities will continue to pose challenges to the exhumation of mass graves, the analysis of the human remains, and the disposition of these remains. The question and issues arising from working with atrocity-derived human remains are valuable and must continue to be discussed within the forensic science and human rights communities. Cambodia is merely one example of the work being done with human remains from an era of mass violence, but is certainly not representative of past or future endeavors. So it is truly unfortunate for humankind that genocide, crimes against humanity, and episodes of mass violence have occurred in the past and are likely to occur in the future and are occurring currently. While forensic anthropologists and archaeologists are not generally positioned to prevent these incidences, they can contribute pertinent information about atrocities after they occur so that the victims are not forgotten. The Analytical and Preservation Project at Chiang Mai was the first systematic assessment of the human remains from the Khmer Rouge period. And as my research and the upcoming project at Krang Tachan demonstrate, there is much more work to be done. The Chiang Mai team and myself sincerely hope that the information gathered from the remains will contribute to a more accurate and holistic understanding of the violence that transpired under the Khmer Rouge regime. While much research still needs to be completed in Cambodia, I hope that this presentation has shed some light on the work being done there and how this research may contribute to the larger fields of forensic anthropology and genocide studies. So there are many organizations and individuals to thank, and I'm not sure what the time frame is. Do we have time for questions?
We have time for questions, so about 5 minutes.
All right, I went through that quickly. Any questions?
I have a question for you.
Yes. Yes, I can try. Thank you. That's a very great question. Healing in Cambodia is a very large discussion, and there are issues as to how to address that or whether to ignore that, and how to proceed forward. There seems to be sort of a dividing line between continuing to focus on the Khmer Rouge period and sort of address it, or to simply say, it happened, let's move forward. So my work, I'm not sure that my work helps in the healing process per se, but I do hope that the work will provide information that isn't currently known, that will help add to sort of the larger understanding of what happened. I don't think my work is going to make anyone feel better by any means, but the memorial part does. Yes, yes.
When I was at the killing fields not long ago, I was surprised that it wasn't. It needs more of a show. It needs to be known, and it hasn't been preserved or been taken care of. So thank you.
Sure. To their credit, they just built a new walkway, which actually now elevates people above the ground, so they're not trotting on bones and clothing that are still eroding out of the ground. So they did do that, and they have an audio tour, but it's only.
Compare that to Germany. Yes.
And in fairness to the Cambodians, I think finances are a huge issue. It costs a lot of money to do that type of memorialization and such, but slowly happening. So thank you. Any other? Yes.
Can you say anything about sort of the ceremony where they reinterred the bones and any of your cultural observations from that? I think that might.
Yes.
And also just a technical question.
Yeah.
The bones have been in those glass cases since the 1980s. Were they eroding? I mean, without all of this, and does the polymers change what can be found scientifically later from the bones?
I'll start with the technical
portion first?
So the bones, until from about 1979 until 88, they were put in a wooden, like sort of an open wooden shelter, essentially, and given the tropical climate and conditions of Cambodia, the bones were exposed to the sun, the rain, the heat, so on and so forth. In 1988, they were put in this memorial, but there was no air circulation. The sun still is beating on them, despite the fact that they're behind glass, and it continues to do that today. So yes, the bones were deteriorating, and they are deteriorating across the country, which is part of the problem, and hopefully the push for this new project is to get this going. As for the polymers, it's not something I have ever done. I've never preserved remains, so I'm merely sort of watching this process. It's been explained to me that the polymers don't change anything, but I think that needs to be sort of determined in the long run. I was fortunately able to look at some remains after they had been preserved, and some of the initial ones that had been preserved, and I think it obscures some things, minor things, but again, I'm not sure who or when or if anyone will go back and do more analysis here. So it's an interesting situation. And then the religious ceremony, so this is one of many pictures that I took, but they had many, actually. There was one sort of sponsored by the Chunghaek Genocidal Center as a sort of entity. This one was sponsored more by the lab director and his team. This one was more elaborate, and it involved, a lot of the traditional beliefs, and there was a white cloth with an inscription or a writing on it that said, for the victims of the Pol Pot regime, we remember you. And this was essentially, it was explained to me as a sort of calling back of the spirits to the remains. So the remains had been in the laboratory, they'd been worked with, and they'd been cared for, certainly, but this was to put them back in the stupa ceremoniously, and then to call their spirits back to the bones so that they're still with their respective remains. So it was actually really nice, and it was a really wonderful thing for me to experience after having worked with the remains for so long, to see sort of this is how it gets handled in sort of a more cultural and religious sense. So that was a real pleasure. Yeah, thanks. 3 minutes, yes.
Regarding the comparison of your material findings with the historical record, just like the distribution of like age, sex, and like the number of violent deaths, if that coincided perfectly with like the story that's being told in the historical record, or if there are any interesting findings.
Sure. Thank you. That's a good
question, and I wish I could give you a full answer. I haven't analyzed the data fully yet. I'm actually just starting to get to that point. The other aspect, well, one of many, but another aspect of my research is to compare the demographics that I was able to generate from looking at the remains, and compare those to the records that the Khmer Rouge had kept at their prisons, which give actual ages and sexes of the people who were then executed. So it's very unusual to have a skeletal sample that you are then able to compare to actual records. That almost never happens. So I'm really hoping to be able to see, what that says, but in a very sweeping sense, I think I did see more sort of blunt injuries to the back of the head, which is what is traditionally said is how people were killed. So, in 500 individuals, I think I saw one gunshot wound. So that was not common. So it does seem to be matching fairly well with the historical record, but that's going to take a lot more work. Thanks.